So you're driving down Winchester Road, and you see a car swerving down the road like a maniac. Naturally, your first instinct would be to stay back, maybe honk, and then think, who gave this guy a license because he's a terrible driver? And at that instant, we individually defined what it means to be a bad driver as opposed to a good driver, and we created a moral standard. But would your verdict change if I told you that this guy's steering wheel broke and the swerving wasn't actually his fault? You see, we do this all the time. We judge based on what we see without considering the context of a situation. This psychological human phenomenon is referred to as the fundamental attribution error, which states that we formulate opinions, judge, and therefore create moral standards not on what we know, but on what we perceive and what we think we know. Morality is defined as the individual perception of right and wrong behavior. But therein lies the question, what is it that we perceive? What do we base these moral perceptions on? Is there a moral law? And is this moral law binding? Meaning, is it universal or subjective to the individual? Matt Slick put it this way: if everything is subjective, then nothing is absolute. This would mean that if all moral values depended on individual desires, then nothing by nature is morally right or wrong. And so there must be a universal moral law. Because if I can make my own moral law, then homework would be illegal and pizza would be free. Now, I'm not the only one who believes in a universal moral law. This conclusion is actually widely accepted among most moral philosophers, so that they've created a series of moral law theories to define the moral law that they know exists. Most notably, we have theories like the divine command theory, which states that there's a higher being that defines morality and defines right from wrong as he sees fit. We also have the natural law theory by Thomas Aquinas that states that because this higher being created us, he instilled in us the moral law and made it a part of human nature. Kant's law of categorical imperatives states the moral law is derived out of pure logic and reason. And utilitarianism states the moral law comes from the consequences of our actions. Now, all of these moral philosophers have one thing in common. They all believe that there is one binding and universal moral law, so long as it's their own, of course, and that different moral values don't come from different moral laws, but a different interpretation and perception of the same universal moral law. For example, let's say the moral law states killing an innocent person is wrong. How many of you agree with this statement? I would hope so. Now, how many of you believe that Nazis would have agreed with this statement? There are no hands up. Here, the difference in interpretation lies in the justification for their actions. Because surprisingly enough, Nazis did believe that killing an innocent person was wrong, but they justified, in their eyes, killing millions of Jewish people by dehumanizing them. And so by stripping the Jews of their humanity, in their eyes, they weren't killing innocent people, but mere burdens to society, and therefore believed they were doing nothing wrong. And so, you see, we have the same moral law, they just had a very radical interpretation of it. Now, that's not to say that every immoral act is justified by a difference in perception of the moral law, or that merely having a moral law guarantees that we will all abide by it. C.S. Lewis put it this way: the law of gravity tells you what stones will do if you drop them, but the law of human nature tells you what human beings ought to do and do not. In other words, the moral law tells us what we should do, but it doesn't reflect what we actually do, even as we know what ought to be done. Part of this has to do with convenience. The other day, my sister was walking around the house with this giant inflatable butterfly, and she accidentally dropped one of my mom's vases. Now, I was standing right next to her, so it would have been convenient for her to blame it on me and not get in trouble. But aside from the fact that the giant butterfly made her the only suspect, lying would have been wrong. And so what's convenient isn't always what's right, even though it's what we do a lot of the times just because it's easy. Or we let our values be dictated by the standards of good and bad distinguished by a certain community or social setting, and society becomes the medium by which we discern right from wrong. We can see this in the Stanford prison experiment, in which volunteer college students were put in a fake prison situation and were randomly assigned to be either guards or prisoners. At the end of the experiment, they found that most of the prisoners had experienced extreme emotional distress, and about 1/3 of the guards had become extremely abusive. And among the experiment observations, it's written that participants and I quote, reacted to the specific needs of their situation rather than referring to their own internal morals and beliefs. So just like the fundamental attribution error, the context in which we experience things and gather information changes our resultant judgment of an act or a concept, and perception strongly influences our moral values even as the moral law remains constant. And it's this difference in perception that has led to one of the greatest dilemmas in moral psychology, the Heinz dilemma. That has nothing to do with the ketchup. So in this dilemma, there was a man named Heinz who had a wife that was gravely ill and at the brink of death. So he goes to see a pharmacist to get the medicine that he needs for his wife to survive. And the pharmacist, seeing how desperate he is, takes advantage of the situation and says, yeah, I'll sell you the medicine, but only for 10 times its original cost. And being that Heinz simply cannot afford such a large sum, he's left with only two options. He can steal the medicine, or he can let his wife die, thus raising the questions, what would have been the right thing to do? Parallel to Jean Piaget's 4 stages of cognitive development, Lawrence Kohlberg uses the Heinz dilemma to create his stages of moral development, which he split up by age groups. In the first stage, young children were presented with this dilemma, and they reacted by saying, Heinz should not steal the medicine, because they feared punishment. They didn't want Heinz to get punished. In stage 2, adolescents also said, no, don't steal the medicine, but because they feared what society would think of him if he did. And in stage 3, adults said, steal the medicine, because his wife's life, above all, was the most important thing. Thus raising the question, what would have been the right thing to do? And so all of these people had a different perception of what the right thing to do would have been. But who's to say whose interpretation was the right one? Because every rebuttal and every argument for and against any moral value is in itself just that. It's a perspective. It's an individual interpretation of the moral law. And so I've come to the conclusion that the closest we can come to defining morality is this. Morality is not what, but who. Thank you.